All right, welcome everybody. So again, once again, I have found that having lunch for students is a tremendous idea. It gets you all here. So, but we have a terrific set of events this week. We have two events, one today and one on Wednesday. I'm just going to talk briefly about the one today. As many of you know, we've had a series of these over a few years now on the issues of technology and regulation. And in particular, we've had Gene Kimmelman with us, who I won't dwell on. I think many of you have heard me introduce him before. And in particular, today we have Tom Wheeler with us. Tom was the former chairman of the Federal Communication Commission here in the United States, has done extensive work on many of the issues, such as creating an agency within the United States to help regulate technology industry. Pretty critical. Today, he's gonna talk about his book, Techlash. You can see the title up on the screen, Who Makes the Rules in the Digital Gilded Age? And just a little bit of background on this. And we've been talking about this off and on for a few years now. He said, today is not the fourth industrial revolution some envision. I think we probably all would agree with that. And then he calls for a new era of public interest oversight. And the obvious question is, what does that mean? Exactly. What's the nature of that oversight? He lists that we leave behind industrial era regulatory ideas. Okay, well, what are those industrial era regulatory ideas that need to be left behind? And then he talks about government approved, government enforced behavioral codes of conduct. Raises the natural question, what's the nature of those codes of conduct? Ones that protect consumers in competition, and encourage continued innovation. Tough balancing act, one that we face in many industries, not just in the tech industry. It's balancing entrepreneurial innovation with public good. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tom. I am actually looking forward to this quite a bit. I'm looking forward to being educated and learning much. So thank you, Tom, for coming.
Thank you, John. And thanks everybody for coming. Many of the ideas that are in this book were developed here at the Kennedy School, and I would be highly remiss if I didn't recognize the fact that my comrade at arms here, Gene Kimmelman, along with Phil Verveer, was the co-author of the original paper here at the Kennedy School that becomes the basis for the recommendations that I make in the end of this book. So, the thesis is that we're living through a new gilded age, a digital gilded age. And so the question becomes, what do we learn from the first one? And how does it relate, if at all, to what we're living through today? Back to the concept of the Gilded Age, when it was, what it was. Mark Twain invented the term for this book here called The Gilded Age, which he actually co-authored. But is to gild. To gild is to put to paint gold over something that isn't, to make it look better than what it is in reality. And so Twain seized on that idea to describe the period of the early Industrial Revolution, roughly starting in the 1870s, and it then continued on until the early 20th century. But to describe the effects of that industrialization on society. Twain also had a great expression where he said, you know, history doesn't repeat itself, but it occasionally rhymes. And I found those two concepts to be the bridge that encouraged me to look at some of the rhymes between today's Gilded Age and the original Gilded Age. Both were periods of technology-driven change. Both had new economic models that produced wondrous new products, low prices. They had the effect of accelerating the pace of life, destroying small businesses, creating wealth disparity, creating monopolies, generating consumer harm, and even fake news. Now, this is where I stop and make you earn your lunch. What is it that you see on this list that you think are the issues of concern today that need to be focused on and highlighted? What are your concerns? Obviously, these are all things that happened in both periods. Which of these concerns most resonate with you? Yes, ma'am. Wealth disparity. Why is that your concern? I agree, but why? What is?
And nations and parts of the world. And yeah, instead of like solving the problem, it just will get like a more urgent problem.
Okay. So we have in this period that we're living through right now, a disparity in wealth that is second only to that of the original Gilded Age. Somebody back here, you had another one. Oh, sir. Yes, sir. You got a fake news.
Wait, if you have one of these in front of you, when you go to speak, all you need to do is push the button and it'll turn green, and then everybody online will be able to hear it as well as hopefully a little better here.
Fake news.
I believe fake news because everything else is objective. You know, you can look around how it was 10 years ago today. But if I don't have information symmetry, I don't really know what is correct in the list.
Great point. In the original Gilded Age, it was a period of yellow journalism. It was the press barons of William Randolph Hearst, Joseph Pulitzer, who would make up stories to sell newspapers because that was how they got their advertising dollars expanded. Gee, do we have anything like that today where online folks promote things that aren't necessarily true in order to get for sell more advertising? My goodness. But it was a period of rampant fake news. And the only thing that brought it in was that in 1922, the newspaper editors decided we need our own organization. And they founded the Society of American Newspaper Editors. And in 1923, they came out with a code of conduct. And newspaper conduct was tell the truth. One of the ideas that we'll develop as we go along here is how can codes of conduct have an impact? Yes, ma'am. Right? So it's an expansion. What we're experiencing today is an expansion of the same kinds of fake news concepts. All right, anybody else? All right, well, let's just look at just so you're not alone, so you know that you're not alone. This is a Pew Research poll on how the American people feel about the power and influence of the big tech companies. Too much power, 68% of Americans. And there are significant, that's total. And there, it doesn't matter which political party or whether you're conservative or liberal, there is a serious level of concern about the power being exhibited, exercised by the digital platform companies. And at the root of this is the feeling that we're playing by somebody else's rules. That we're the pawns in this game. And throughout history, it has always been the innovators who make the rules. It's how we have progress, you know, and in science and technology and business and in the art, it's always the innovators who see what's possible, have no fear about breaking the rules to achieve that. This was the guy who paid for the Gilded Age. That's an overstatement, but he was a principal financier of the early Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age, the financier J.P. Morgan. And his concept of how you make the rules was this incredible quote where he said, a certain number of men who own property can do what they like with it. A more sophisticated way of saying the same thing was Mark Zuckerberg's move fast and break the rules. So what are we breaking? What is he breaking? He's not breaking tables. He's breaking the standards that heretofore had provided stability. And why do you do that fast? Why do you have to move fast? Because you need to get those new standards, those new rules that you established, inculcated into daily life and economic activity before anybody catches on. And the result of both of these innovators making the rules was that they end up acting like pseudo governments. And the interesting thing is that ultimately in this era, the government of the people stepped in, and in this era, it has not. Which is why this book suggests we need to be doing something. So this is our digital reality today. I call it the digital chain reaction. That it starts with your private information and my private information turn asset because of the new rules that we didn't have a say in making. And then once you control that asset, you can control markets. This quote from Lena Khan, the chairwoman of the Federal Trade Commission, concentrated control over data for sure. got the make rule it for I did see longer form Zuckerberg made an announcement. See is no social. All the that who's supporting information to give you control. You have control. You ever go across that? Can draw in engage. We're talking to go to the press, and to do that, what do? You create more information that feeds back into here. And the digital chain reaction continues and continues, and it starts with, we're going to make our own rules. And today, it explodes. But when you stop and think about it, all of this information that was created, all of this market concentration that gives power in terms of development, other activities, feed into the development of artificial intelligence. And then that artificial intelligence enhances all of these problems again. It makes your privacy greater. Hey, what are we trained on? Trained on all your information that you did on the net, whether or not you gave permission for it. Feeds market concentration. We've now got big AI, not just big tech. And of course, it moves things to a new level of information control, because it's no longer you're just curating information, you can create information with AI. And that AI explosion ends up producing all kinds of wondrous new opportunities for economic growth, scientific discovery, while at the same time threatening apocalypse. I love this quote from Tristan Harris, that nukes are to the physical world as AI is to everything else. So we live here in this environment that we have grown out of the digital economy for the last couple of decades into a new AI-driven economy that offers us apocalypse or great things as alternatives, and we have totally failed to deal with the issues that got us here and that become worse as a result of AI. And it shouldn't be that we're sitting here going, "Aw, shucks, how did this happen?" Again, Tristan Harris, several others. Social media was the first contact between AI and humans, and humanity lost. And Lena Khan, the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, says, hey, look, just stop and think that what we allowed to happen in the early days of digital technology should inform our activities today in an AI environment. Because our world has changed. The Gilded Age was an industrial age in which mechanical power replaced or augmented physical power. We have now eased into the new Digital Gilded Age, where computing power is replacing or augmenting human cognitive power. And so we see this situation. We know this change is going on around us. We know all the negative impacts, like you all pointed out a moment ago, that have resulted thus far in the digital era. And our thinking is stuck in the past. And we say, what do we do about this? We're stuck with old style thinking. There is a need for oversight. But we discuss 21st century challenges in 20th century terms and propose 19th century solutions. And I need to give credit where credit's due. That's not my line. That's the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. She and I were having a discussion one day, and we were talking about the impact of technology on diplomacy. And she says, well, you know, the problem is with diplomacy is that we take 21st century challenges, discuss them in 20th century terms, and have 19th century solutions. And I said, Madam Secretary, consider that line stolen. But that is our reality. We are stuck in our thinking about what existed yesterday and the solutions that were applied at that point in time. As I said a moment ago, when we were talking about Mr. Morgan and Mr. Zuckerberg, the government stepped in the original age to put guardrails around those activities. And in so doing, they created an industrial structure, industrial oversight structure that is inadequate for today, that doesn't adequately protect consumers, that doesn't have the agility that's necessary to keep pace with the rapid change. And yet, when we do get around to talking about, well, what are we going to do about both the things that we've swept under the rug for the last 20 years, as well as the new challenges, we tend to go back to old industrial ideas. Those agencies are inadequate for today. Let me start for a second. I've quoted Lena Khan, the chairman of the FTC, twice. She's terrific. Her agency is fabulous. These agencies, agency I used to head the FCC, populated by dedicated individuals. The problem is that their enabling statutes were written to deal with a different set of problems. This is their problem. They look like their pet. When it came time to regulate industrial activities, the government designed that regulatory management to copy the management of the industrial companies themselves. And what was that management? This is Frederick W. Taylor. He was the management guru of the original Gilded Age. He wrote a book called Principles of Scientific Management. And this is an excerpt from it. And it's important to pay attention to the italicized words. I didn't italicize those. Taylor italicized those. It is only through enforced standardization of methods, enforced adoption of the best implements and working conditions, and enforced cooperation that faster work can be assured. In other words, squeeze every innovative ounce out of the process, and you will get the best kind of scope and scale production, which was the hallmark again of the industrial era. But it produced a structure that was rigid, enforced, sclerotic, excuse me, there's our way and the wrong way, and micromanagement. Think about it. There was a guy on the shop floor, and he was a guy, that followed a rule book. One of the reasons that we have free public education in this country was in order that workers could read enough to read the rule book. And he was supervised by a level of supervisors to make sure he was following the rules. And they were supervised by a level of corporate managers, all driven with the idea of top down, this is how things will be. That's not the way the world works in the digital environment. We don't have that kind of rigid, but that kind of rules-based layered bureaucracy is how we still regulate. So one of the things that the book talks about is it's time to look like our pet again. Let's go back and say, if we are overseeing digital activity, how can we clone the management techniques of that digital activity and bring them into oversight? What are the management techniques in the digital environment? Transparency. What's going on? Everybody shares in what's going on. Risk-based. How do we assess what the threats are and respond? Threats in new technology, threats in changes in the marketplace, and how do we respond to risks rather than dictating things? And agility. Every time your smartphone downloads a new software update, it's demonstrating the role of agility, the role that agility plays in digital management. So the reality we find ourselves in today is that digital management has changed, but government oversight of that management has not. And it is a thing that is relevant to all of us in terms of what's the policy of the United States, but it is also relevant in terms of how the United States relates to around the world. That as we in the United States have a death grip on industrial style regulation, the EU is moving forward, as Jean has told us about multiple times. The EU is moving forward with a new set of rules and a new set of concepts. Great Britain has done the same since they've dropped out of the EU, and China is doing the same. So as we are looking backwards, other nations of the world are looking forward. And it is time, therefore, for us to start getting serious, both in terms of our domestic activities and in terms of our our international relationships. It is time for us to get serious about thinking anew about how we regulate 21st century activities. It's a time for rebalancing. We need to have a rebalancing of private interests and public interests. We need to have a balancing in a way that avoids rigid micromanagement in order to encourage innovation. And we need to have a structure that can deal with what we don't know is coming, but we are sure it is. The unknowns. And so what Gene and Phil Verveer and I worked on, what was it now, 4 years ago, was the importance of a new federal regulatory agency that has digital DNA, if you will. This is the headline that everybody focuses on. Oh, a new agency. But this is what is important. How that agency works and how that agency operates in a way that clones those it's supposed to be overseeing. That in place of rigid rules, you establish agile behavioral codes that evolve with the changes in technology and the marketplace. On Wednesday, this idea has been introduced in the United States Senate by Senator Welch and Senator Bennett. On Wednesday, you will have the opportunity to have a virtual one-on-one with Senator Peter Welch, who is the author of legislation creating a digital platform commission with these kinds of new structures, so that you can share with him your thoughts and hear his as to why he thinks that this is the kind of way that we have to be heading forward. Senator Welch and Senator Bennett are 2% of the United States Senate. They get this challenge. But a lot of people say, oh, there's no way you could ever overcome the special interests, how they've captured. Many of you probably remember this from your high school history book tune. This is the title here is The Bosses of the Senate. Here are all the senators, and here are all Steel Beam Trust, Copper Trust, Standard Oil, all of the big industrial interests who actually bought and sold members of Congress. Cold cash in the original Gilded Age. And still, that Congress was able to produce first iterations of industrial oversight. The Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate railroads. It was the first federal independent agency. The Sherman Antitrust Act, Pure Food and Drug Act, Federal Trade Commission Act. So it is possible, even in the most difficult of time, to step up and rebalance between public interest and private interests. And that's our challenge today. It's time to make history again. Entrepreneurs and their investors drive innovation and make the rules. God bless them. That's how we have advancement. But there comes a point when that rulemaking infringes on the rights and the public interest. And I would suggest we are long past that point in our digital Gilded Age. That in the original industrial, or in the original Gilded Age, those members of Congress that you saw a moment ago were confronted with never before seen industrial challenges and came up with never before seen solutions. You don't have to go back and repeat what was done before. Never before seen challenges, never before seen solutions. And that's what we have today in the digital Gilded Age. Never before seen digital challenges that demand the same kind of originality and creativity. And so our challenge, as we consider how to regulate, how to oversee these great things, and let's make no mistake about it, they're terrific things that have been introduced to us all, and we all benefit from. But how do we establish the guardrails? And that's what Techlash is all about. How can we be as innovative in oversight as those who created the need for the oversight in the first place? And I want to end on a slightly different approach. That the argument in this book is that as times and technology change, so must we. It really isn't a radical idea. This is the statue of Thomas Jefferson at the Jefferson Memorial in Washington. And this is what is written on the southeast wall of that memorial, my bolding in here. I'm not an advocate for frequent changes in laws and constitutions, but laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths discovered, and manners and opinions, with the change of circumstances must advance, also to keep pace with the times. We might as well require a man to wear still the coat which fitted him when a boy, as a civilized society, to remain ever under the regimen of barbarous ancestors. And there is the rationale for why we need new rules in a digital gilded age. Let's get the boy a new coat. Thank you. Be happy to talk about anything you want to talk about. Fire away. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much for your talk. Obviously, one of the issues that we've historically had in regulating digital governance or in digital governance in general is a lack of technological talent or understanding within the government. How would you suggest building the capacity within the new agency to address that problem?
You've got to get serious about hiring that kind of talent and paying for it. You know, I don't know whether you were here last month at the session that we had on AI, in which I showed a video of Eric Schmidt on Meet the Press saying the government has no idea, they have can't do this at all, and therefore industry has to make the rules. And at that point in time, I said, well, let's see, we did split the atom. You know, we did take men to and from the moon safely. But the other thing that dawned on me afterwards is that members of Congress are not technologists. Gene and I, who spent the last 40 years working with them, will stipulate to that. But you know, I bet there's not a handful of members of Congress who can explain jet propulsion or Bernoulli's principle on why airplanes stay in the sky. but we can regulate the manufacture of aircraft and their safe operation. And I think it's that kind of can-do attitude and recruitment that we have to bring to this challenge as well.
Thank you so much for the presentation. So what are the rules and how should we develop them in this agile form? Do you see good examples
Read
emerging?
the book now. You told me you ordered the book and it hadn't come yet. But you got to read the book now. That the answer is that Gene and I and Phil believe is again going back to this concept of codes and how do you create a multi-stakeholder process that will establish behavioral codes that are also enforceable. And that's one of the reasons that I mentioned the American Society of Newspaper Editors and what they did in 1923. You know, there are codes that cover everything except the behavior of digital companies when they're consumer facing. You know, when the digital companies are acting as consumers, okay, building the technologies, they got technical codes, they got technical standards because they want to make sure that the Gazinta and the Gazeta, you know, work together. And they pull together these multi-stakeholder groups of innovators, manufacturers, the digital companies themselves and others to develop technical standards. And then when they go to deliver those products, they forget about any behavioral responsibility, let alone any behavioral standards. And so what we need is we need an agency that says, hey, we need to have behavioral expectations. It's not just, well, let's do it and damn the consequences, the hell of the consequences. We need to have behavioral expectations that are developed in an agile way and able to continue to evolve, but can be enforced by the government. And an ongoing oversight process that is independent of the government and independent of the agencies that relies heavily on academics and specialists to say, here are the changes that are taking place that we have to make sure that we're staying on top of. And that's, I've now just given you the last half of the book. And we're gonna go back here and look up. Yes, sir. Grassroots. It was a result of a coalition of progressive and populists. It was really interesting. Populists had the attitude, we don't want these big companies, we don't, you know, this is, you know, let's go back to an agrarian society. And the progressives were saying, oh no, you know, we can do something about this. If we put some kind of oversight over, and they came together as a coalition to create these kinds of structures. And they evolved over time. I mean, it's an interesting story. The first one was the Interstate Commerce Commission. It was created in 1887. The push for it started in 1867. With the organization of the Grange, which was all the farmers getting together saying, we're getting screwed by the railroads. Let's stand up for our rights. And it went through multiple iterations, which we talk about in the book, that first, let's try it in the States. Well, you can get something in the States, but the problem is it's interstate commerce. So if Minnesota has this rule and Iowa has this rule, that's a problem. And so finally, they got a federal agency to overcome those kind of problems. But it wasn't until almost another 20 years before Teddy Roosevelt gave it the teeth that it really needed to do the enforcement that it needed. So this is not an overnight process. But it does start with, which is why I think the Pew poll is really important. If 68% of the American people, regardless of their political affiliation, say big tech is too powerful, we need to do something about it, there's a message there. Yes, sir, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you, sir. Can you hear me? Just a qualification, I'm not a student. I co-chair, I'm a lawyer, co-chair my firm's technology and financial services group back from India visiting. In fact, this topic, given my country, is very critical because it's the biggest market for many of these companies. So dealing with mamas and fangs and bats and our equivalent is an occupational hazard. Just one question, a few observations. Would you feel that the current regulatory framework, how you concluded, be it the telegraph laws or personal invasion at some level, if you apply normal criminal laws on don't bother me, no nuisance, nobody has tried it. Because the one challenge one is seeing world over is if you create a non-data framework for digital. So data is one part, digital is second. Then the overlaps and the frictions it may cause with other regulators, antitrust, telecommunications is fairly significant. And so the second observation, every innovator, every industry sees the future and builds layers. You see Ford, Apple, Goldman Sachs. I mean, you see Tesla. So, and then they become monopolistic, they become arrogant, and society then reclaims the space. So probably what is so bad with tech? Of course, it has issues. My question is, should the cycle be allowed to play out? Has it played out before law comes in? Or are we still at the beginning?
Great question. On your first privacy issue, the Fourth Amendment isn't doing too well in the Supreme Court these days as a broad tool. On your second question about they're great until they become big and then they aren't. And I talk about this a lot in the book. Nobody has repealed the law of human nature. Okay? The law of human nature is, how do I advantage myself? And when you are coming up the hill and charging, you got this new idea and we want to change things. I mean, and then you get to the top of the hill and your job changes. It's, how do I kick sand in the face of the people coming up the hill? Nobody has repealed the law of human nature, which is why you don't want to too early come in and prejudge things, but you also don't want to do what we've done thus far, which is sit on our hands. And you also want to do it in a way that is flexible enough to encourage innovation. And that's what I propose in the book. Sir.
Thank you very much for presenting the book to us today. A few weeks ago, you have given us the example of a toaster being launched on the market and the licensing.
You were paying attention.
To that. Yeah.
I'm glad. I loved that example.
Yeah, me too. I really loved it. But I was wondering now, I think you referred to it with comparing the regulation of AI and the launching an AI application, right, on the toaster. When you speak about regulation now, what are the fields of regulation or of law you think of are most important in addressing the challenges you laid out? And should we focus on, in fact, licensing AI, or should we focus more on antitrust or liability and other issues?
Great question. Let me stumble around multiple ways about that. First of all, as you know, big AI has proposed to the federal government there should be a licensing program. I ran the federal government's largest licensing program when I was chairman of the FCC, licensing of the airwaves. I can tell you without fear of successful contradiction that licensing is anti-competitive, anti-innovative, and perpetuates the role of those who have the license. Having said that, I think it's terrific that they have at least, that these same companies who, for the last 20 years, have been saying, I'll meet you at the door with a shotgun if you try and regulate me, are at least now saying, okay, let's talk about what regulation is. And so that dialogue has begun, and the kind of code-based agility that I've proposed, I think, is the way to go after it. You had another part of your question. I've now forgotten it. Oh, yeah. So you've got to, I think there's multiple layers, but obviously we have ignored privacy, competition, and truth and trust for too long. Okay. We've clearly got to deal with those, not only because of the fact that they're endemic issues, but also they're the issues that create the data that feeds AI. So, and they're made worse by it. Then you've got a series of issues where new technology takes old bad things and makes them better. Fraud is illegal, whether it's done through the mail or online. Right? We got the tools to deal with that in our existing agencies. But what we need to be focused then on is, okay, if we get the ground basis of the things that we've swept under the rug for the last 20 years, how do we deal with what we know is coming that we want to encourage to come, but we want to say, innovation, hooray, public interest, private rights, how do we describe that? And I think that's, again, the structure that we have proposed. 1, 2.
And one thing that I wonder about is how to strike that balance between, so you mentioned privacy and you also mentioned trust, but there's also this idea that you can't really give full privacy and trust because, you have to trust but verify. So I think I'm just curious, like, how do you propose striking that kind of balance?
Exactly right. That there is, the art of governing is the art of making choices and balancing. I used to come home and say to my wife over the dinner table when I was chairman, the public interest is really quite a fungible thing, right? Everybody would always come into the chairman's office and say, here's the public interest, you must do this, including those who really were saying, well, it's in my interest only, but if you stand on your head in the corner and squint, then you might see how it could be in the public interest. And it becomes a balance about all of those issues. But the problem is that the balance is being made today, or the imbalance is being created today by people who profit from tilting it this way. Now, let me just back up. I am a capital C capitalist. I'm an entrepreneur. I have started multiple companies. I was a venture capitalist before I went into the government. I believe I like Mark Zuckerberg. I still consider him a friend. I'm not sure he does me, but I don't want Mark making the unilateral decision. Privacy is no longer a social norm. And therefore, we're going to change all of the algorithms in Facebook so that it won't just be that you and I connect because we went to high school together, but it's going to be that I'm going to take all the information that I can possibly gather from you, suck it up, and figure out how I'm going to use it. The job of a policymaker is a balancing of interests job. Yes, ma'am. You're getting a mic coming around to you.
But now we're at a new round of industrial revolution, technology revolution, and US is facing different global competitions from other countries. What do you think Is there any inspiration or reflection we can draw from the past industrial revolution to this new round of technology revolution? How, especially right now, there are a lot of industrial policies in the US, how the US should balance that smart regulation policy domestically and also in face of that global competition?
It's a great question. One of the stories I talk about in the book is that in 1864, as the telegraph was being introduced into Europe, the nations of Europe got together and created the International Telegraph Union, the first supranational body in international affairs, in which they ceded rights to establish rates, terms, and conditions to this, for all of Europe, to this body. That body went through multiple iterations. The EU, the European Union. But it was the first supranational driven by the new technology. We're in a similar situation today, where we need to have common rules, common concepts. I'll digress for a second. When I was chairman, we passed the net neutrality rules. 2 weeks later, I was in Europe with our general counsel, John Sallet, who's the absent member here today, in which we were helping the EU write their net neutrality rules based on our experience, not so they would be identical, but so they would be compatible. We need to use these activities to create that same kind of a concept. It started in AI 2 weeks ago in Bletchley. It started at the G7 with AI. But the problem first has to be solved by, if you don't know where you sit, you don't know where you stand. There need to be domestic rules that inform your position at the table. And we in the United States do not have those domestic rules. And other countries, particularly authoritarian countries, do. And that is a bad position for us to be in, which is yet, I believe, another reason why we need to have our own set of domestic policies. So I'm gonna, you have one, Caroline. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So there's been a pattern. I'm a technologist myself, but I also did philosophy in undergrad. And I'm very interested in how technology companies are regulated and run as businesses. And to be honest, as a young person growing up in the internet age, I've been very disappointed about the solutions that we've come up with. Airbnb has not done what it's supposed to do. I mean, we've just dumped $200 billion in investments into self-driving cars, which is failing miserably. There's all these economic incentives for pursuing certain routes for technological innovation that keep failing. And unfortunately, it seems like people are not paying the cost of that, meaning the companies and the people funding these programs are not paying the costs of those failures. In fact, most of the time, they just cut costs by firing people en masse, which is happening at the biggest level, like Google and Microsoft last year. So all that to say is, how do you propose that the government promote codes of conduct and behavior in tech companies as businesses, not as technology companies, but just as businesses?
It's a really good question. And I think we need to back up and recognize, remember I said that I was for 10 years before I was chairman, I was a partner in a VC firm. Far more of my companies failed than those that hit home runs, because that's the way it works. We need to be encouraging failure. Okay. And the difficulty is that too often we both corporately and governmentally subsidize failure. But failure is a good thing. And I'll just say one quick story. When I was chairman, I was in the UK and I was visiting with a bunch of startups there. And they were talking about how failure marks them for life. We don't dare fail because we'll be marked for life. Well, as I said, I was an entrepreneur. I can show you the dead bodies of companies that I started. I can also show you successful companies. And I learned from each of those. I think there are, and so I think that we need to have business practices and governmental practices that allow for failure and that that have consequences for failure. Now, I also will stand here and tell you, not naive. And the problem is that failure in government is ammunition for the other side. And so we ran a program that provided mobile phones, subsidized mobile phones for low-income Americans. And there were tens of millions of people who were able to call 911 because of this, that were able to fill out a job application because they're only taking job applications online. There was also some folks who took advantage of it. Guess what I got beaten around the head and shoulders with? Not that let's talk about all these great successes, but I got these handful of problems here. You raise a really important question. It is not a question that has a simple answer, but it is a question that that cannot be ignored, and that we cannot run if we are going to clone the management techniques of the digital era. We also have to clone the right to fail. Carolina.
I will not leave you alone. So lots of questions, but I want to build on her question before in terms of geopolitics, right? What you actually would hear in the corridors of Congress when we had some of the initial hearings at Facebook was before Meta, is that we cannot break Facebook because otherwise who's going to compete with Alibaba, right? So there was, again,
Yes.
So again, right, what is the interest? And you see now Europe trying to push for new policies on the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, to boost innovation, but they are not catching up, right? So you still have that geopolitical dispute that can put a lot of barriers to this. So that's one question, your take on geopolitics there and how that's a real barrier or not, especially next year we have elections. And the next question is building on him, right? One of the things my organization is trying to do, and we have a partnership with the Africa Trade Union to actually do that in the real world, is sandboxes, right? So how we can develop sandboxes to agile, to create agile regulation. But then the pushback actually doesn't come from governments and business sector, it comes from the technologists saying, oh, we will never be able to replicate the technology well enough in sandboxes to regulate. But then what do you do, right? If you can never do good enough, should you do nothing? But anyway, so those two questions.
Look, innovating is hard. Okay. I was the CEO of the first company to deliver high-speed data over cable television lines that went bankrupt. I was the CEO of the first company to deliver digital video via satellite. We sold it, but it was less than a huge success. You need to understand, and it goes kind of back to this other gentleman's question, that it's tough. There are, it's making policy is tough, making products is tough, and smoothing the way. You want true opportunity to have effective competition, but removing that risk is not something that we want to do. There is, the lady, she's now left, I guess, but I was over at Cambridge, the other Cambridge, a year or so ago. And I'm sitting in a meeting with some students who are from the People's Republic of China. And that very question came up. And one of the students babbled something in Chinese, which obviously I didn't understand. And I asked her to translate. And she said, oh, it's an expression that we have in the development community. The more you try, the more you fail. And then she explained it as, and I understand that, I'll show you my scars. She said, no, that's not what I'm saying. She's saying that the more you try, unless it fits with the line that has been established by the government, you are guaranteed to fail. And what we want to make sure, we don't want to get there. We don't want to make development risk-free. But at the same point in time, well, we need to be saying, okay, how do we go down this road and build guardrails? We can talk more about that. Gene, oh my God, I don't want to answer a question from my co-conspirator.
I'm just gonna do an observation for you to comment on. The line of questioning from all of you is fascinating and not surprising to us. When we sat down to work on this originally, all of these issues came up. And here's my observation. We found that there were simple principles in law that had existed for a long, long time, basically framed around the idea of a duty of care, that had been built into other bodies of law, like antitrust with specific rules, and that we needed something like that. The other observation was that history had shown that markets never fully self-correct. There is some correcting that goes on if you wait long enough sometimes, but in this digital era, we had network effects, economies of scale and scope, the growing power of data, and we seem to have entrenchment around key areas: search, app stores, operating systems, and social networking. And so when we put all that together, we then said the problem too is without there being some government role, everyone just points the finger at each other or at the ceiling or at the sky or the ground, and there is no accountability. So that all came down to the idea of an agency, the need for specialization and expertise. And then everything that you've asked that's a tough question, we thought in the history, it's always been dealt with through some balancing process and through some responsible entity. And so you needed the responsible entity and you needed a framework that allowed balancing. And then finally, on the impossibility of doing this, even though it was done at the turn of the 20th century, Europe is doing it. The UK is doing it. China has its own rules. For better or for worse, it will be a huge market. India probably as well. And so the companies will respond in that geopolitical context because it is a global market. And so then everyone will need to figure out their own balance and adjust the balance, because we'll never get it right in the first instance, or the second or third probably. But we need the institutional framework for those things to play out.
And now you've seen why I hang out with Gene. Okay, should we have some drawings?
Well, not quite yet. I have a couple comments I just want to make real quickly. I can't resist. And some of my comments are along the lines that Gene was making. But one, a number of people have raised this question of kind of international kind of issues and geopolitics. And I think one thing that is significantly different in this situation than what was occurring in the Gilded Age is that in the Gilded Age and the Industrial Revolution, you really had this within the United States. And right now, because of the nature of technology and information flows, if you look at trade flows, the amount of trade between has somewhat flattened. But if you look at information flows, they're skyrocketing, and information flows between countries. And so you have to figure out how you're going to manage this in a global context. And right now, you know, we've had sessions on this in the past, but the EU is so far ahead of the United States in thinking about how to regulate with the Digital Marketing Act, the Digital Services Act, and a variety of other situations and technologies that they're setting the landscape on a global basis. So what you see is EU creates the GDPR, the data regulation entity regulation, and California picks it up and replicates it for California. And then Brad Smith from Microsoft comes on and says, please don't make me write different software instantiations because that's really, really expensive. So why don't you just standardize? And we might not write GDPR exactly the way the Europeans did live with it. So why don't you all just standardize on that? And all of a sudden that becomes the global mechanism.
Including
and that's the
China.
way these are,
Including in China.
and including China to some extent. So that's kind of the significant difference, that this is much more of a global question, and the geopolitics of it are much more important than in the Gilded Age. The second thing is I want to follow up on a couple comments on business models, and in particular, kind of the nature of the different business models. And, you know, if we use AI as an example, and we talked about this in some of the earlier sessions, but if you think about AI, you have at some level what are called foundational models. And those foundational models are basically creating the tool that you can then create applications using that tool, right? And if you think about it, these are starting to require just massive amounts of computing power. And the only people that do it at scale are the 2, 3, 4 large firms. And so this begs the question from a regulatory perspective, how do I deal with that issue? And given the importance of scale, you got to think about ex ante. Do you almost create a natural monopoly that's regulated? Is it a natural monopoly of sorts that requires regulation ex ante, right? You have to set the rules and set the standards and set the requirements early. But if you think about the uses on AI, those can be regulated under, I believe, probably some of the existing regulations, but adapted to a digital era. And so you're kind of adjusting them, because if the law not online and you're breaking that same law online, you should suffer the same consequences, right? So there are mechanisms there, but it puts a high premium on how you think about the regulation ex ante versus the regulation ex post, when you've let the thing develop and then you have to figure out how to address it. And all of that is to say, I think it is this balancing point is incredibly critical, because you are balancing and making these trade-offs. And what Tom, I think, is getting at with the book, one big piece of it is who should be doing that balancing. And it shouldn't be, you know, Mark Zuckerberg at Meta. It should be somebody and some group operating in public interest. And in particular, I think that needs to, Tom is persuading me. I'm not sure I was there early on, but he's persuading me that you need a new agency to really do that and build the expertise and the knowledge, and probably not build it just within the FTC, because we don't think that will work.
Bingo.
But, so anyhow, with
You
that, I want to.
Queensberry commitment is what you're
Yeah,
saying.
exactly.
But this is old
A
telephone
little
talk.
inside baseball from my. I used to run AT&T's international. I was president of AT&T's international operations, so have as much a business background as I do a regulatory.
Okay, should we dive into the
So-
fishbowl?
Thank you very much, everybody. We're going to do the drawing here in a
So-
second, but Claire needs to